Picture this. A scream tears through the frozen corridors of Pembroke Castle on a January night in 1457. It is not the cry of battle, nor the howl of the Welsh winter storm battering the battlements. It is the piercing, desperate scream of a child in labor. Inside a chamber lit only by the trembling glow of candles, 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort clings to blood-soaked sheets, her small frame racked by pain no child should ever know. The midwives murmur prayers in Latin, their hands trembling as they prepare their instruments. Shadows lurch across the stone walls as the wind rattles the windows, carrying with it the salt-stung breath of the Atlantic. Margaret's auburn hair is plastered to her face with sweat. Her body convulses under each contraction, her narrow hips resisting the demands of nature forced upon her too soon. She is not ready, not physically, not emotionally. At 13, her bones are still growing, her body still that of a child. Yet, tonight, she is forced to become a mother. Those present whisper that she may not survive the night. The baby is too large, her body too frail. But survival is not a choice, it is destiny. For the child she carries will one day sit on England's throne. Out of her agony will be born the future Henry VII, founder of the Tudor Dynasty, the king who will end the Wars of the Roses and reshape England's fate. The irony of it is cruel. A dynasty that will dominate European history for more than a century begins here. In blood, in fear, in the broken body of a girl scarcely old enough to comprehend her own suffering. But in this moment, no one thinks of the grand sweep of history. They think only of saving the young mother, of coaxing the infant into the world before both perish. Outside, the snow falls silently upon Pembrokeshire, covering the land in white purity, as if mocking the brutality unfolding inside these ancient walls. Margaret Beaufort was no ordinary noble girl. In her veins ran the blood of kings, the line of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of Edward III. It was this blood that made her both treasure and target. In 15th century England, lineage was a weapon, and a girl like Margaret could be used as pawn or poisoned as threat. Tonight, that same bloodline is on the brink of ending, depending on whether she survives. The chamber reeks of sweat, herbs, and fear. One midwife presses a relic, a splinter said to be from the true cross, into Margaret's palm. Another whispers the name of Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth, hoping heaven itself will intervene. Margaret's cries weaken, turning from piercing that her resilience was forged here, in this room, in this hour, when death loomed so close she could almost feel its hand. History often remembers kings as warriors on battlefields, but dynasties are born in quieter, bloodier struggles, in chambers like this, where a child fights to deliver a child. Tonight, destiny hangs on a knife's edge, balanced between the life of a 13-year-old girl and the fragile cry of an infant who will change the course of a nation. To understand why a child's scream in a remote Welsh castle could shake the destiny of a kingdom, we must step back and look at the blood running through Margaret Beaufort's veins. She was not just a young girl in pain, she was the living embodiment of a claim to England's throne. Her lineage traced back to John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster and son of Edward III. John of Gaunt had fathered children not only through his marriages, but also through his long relationship with Catherine Swynford. Their offspring, the Beauforts, were later legitimized by royal decree, yet with one critical stipulation. Though legal heirs, they were barred from inheriting the crown. It was a technicality most believed would bury their royal ambitions forever. But in the chaos of 15th century England, forever rarely lasted more than a generation. Margaret grew up hearing whispers of this bloodline, half blessing, half curse. To have royal blood was to carry both opportunity and peril. It could raise you to the throne or drag you to an early grave. In a kingdom spiraling toward the Wars of the Roses, even the faintest link to Edward III's line could make you a pawn in deadly games of power. The England of Margaret's childhood was a land fraying at the seams. The 100 Years' War was ending in defeat, leaving behind humiliation and debt. Nobles nursed grudges, kings faltered, and the question of succession loomed over every council chamber. Into this unstable world was born a girl who, by blood alone, could be considered a contender, or a threat. For Margaret's mother, Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, this was both a gift and a burden. She knew her daughter's blood could secure alliances, but it also painted a target on her back. In medieval England, noble daughters were not raised to dream of love or choice. They were raised to be married, strategically, quickly, and often cruelly. Marriage was not romance, it was statecraft. For a girl like Margaret, the path to survival was paved with vows made in candlelit chapels, her life bartered away in contracts sealed by wax and dagger. Royal blood did not shield Margaret from danger, it magnified it. Every uncle, cousin, and rival noble who gazed upon her saw not a child, but a claim. Every betrothal carried the weight of kingdoms. Every smile at court could mask a dagger in the dark. And so, while other children her age played in castle gardens, Margaret's future was already being carved by forces far larger than herself. Before she was old enough to read, she was bound into agreements that treated her not as a person, but as a bargaining chip. She was Lancaster's prize, Lancaster's risk, Lancaster's hope. In the candlelit halls where her mother and guardians whispered about alliances, one truth became clear. Margaret Beaufort's blood made her valuable, but never safe. Before Margaret Beaufort ever drew her first breath, her family line was already haunted by disgrace. Her father, John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, carried the weight of expectations far heavier than his weary shoulders could bear. He was tasked with continuing England's war in France during the dying embers of the 100 Years' War, a war that had once been England's glory, but was by then its bleeding wound. John led armies not with the fire of conquest, but with the shadow of failure at his back. France was slipping away piece by piece, every stronghold once won by Henry V now falling back into French hands. Castles that had flown England's banners for decades were surrendered. Towns once claimed as victories were lost overnight. Soldiers returned to England weary, unpaid, and bitter, their loyalty crumbling alongside their morale. Defeat gnawed at John Beaufort like a slow disease. Courtiers described his hollow cheeks, his sleepless eyes, the way his hands trembled as he spoke in council. To fail in war was not just to lose battles, it was to lose honor. In a world where reputation was everything, dishonor was a death sentence. By 1444, John returned to England a broken man. His enemies whispered that he was incompetent, a disgrace to the Lancastrian cause. His friends feared for his health, and in the corridors of power, some muttered darker things, that his death might be more useful than his life. On May 27th of that year, he was found dead at Wimborne Minster. The official cause was given as fever, but no one believed it. Whispers spread like wildfire. Poison, perhaps, from political rivals eager to erase a failed commander. Others suspected suicide, that shame had driven him to choose death over further humiliation. In the 15th century, poison was the convenient explanation for any untimely death among nobles. Every unexpected passing carried the scent of conspiracy. Whether true or not, the rumors clung to John Beaufort's name, ensuring that his legacy was not of valor, but of disgrace and mystery. For young Margaret, barely a year old, the loss was more than personal tragedy. It was the first lesson life would teach her, that in the game of power, even bloodlines cannot guarantee safety. She grew up hearing fragments of her father's downfall, stories of dishonor, whispers of suicide, suspicions of betrayal. They lingered in the halls of Pembroke Castle like ghosts, shaping her childhood with silence heavier than words. His absence left her mother scrambling to secure Margaret's future. In a world where a woman's worth was measured in her dowry and her marriage, the loss of a duke's steady hand meant danger. For Margaret, her father's fall was not just a family wound. It was the opening act of a life where survival would always depend on adapting to loss, betrayal, and shifting allegiances. With her father gone, Margaret's life was no longer her own. It became a ledger entry in her mother's careful negotiations. The widowed Margaret Beaufort of Bletsoe knew the rules of survival all too well. In a kingdom where noble blood was currency, her daughter was the coin she had to spend wisely. By the age of 6, little Margaret was no longer simply a child playing in the gardens of Pembroke Castle. She was already promised as bride. Her hand was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the powerful Duke of Suffolk. For most children, 6 years old meant chasing butterflies or learning prayers. For Margaret, it meant signing her future away with ink and wax seals. The contract tied her to one of the greatest families in England. It seemed a brilliant move. Lancaster and Suffolk bound together in alliance, shoring up political strength at a time when cracks were already spreading through the kingdom. To outsiders, it looked like security. But beneath the surface, the alliance rested on shifting sand. This was the fate of noble daughters in the 15th century. They were not raised for themselves, but for the ambitions of others. Their bodies became vessels for dynasties, their names woven into treaties, their childhood stolen in the pursuit of power. Marriage was not a private vow, but a public weapon. A girl's wedding day was less about love and more about chess, another move in a game played by men in shadowed halls. Margaret would grow up with this reality pressed into her bones. She was taught to curtsy before elders, to smile when spoken to listen more than she spoke, but above all, she was taught that her destiny was not hers to shape. It would be chosen for her, written in contracts negotiated before she could even read. And yet, within this bleak reality, there lingered a cruel paradox. The very blood that made her so desirable as a bride also made her dangerous. To marry Margaret was not simply to gain a wealthy estate, it was to touch the line of Lancaster itself. Any family who took her hand also took on the potential for a royal claim. That made her valuable. It also made her a threat. In this dangerous calculus, her betrothal to John de la Pole was less about childhood innocence and more about high-stakes politics. At 6 years old, Margaret had already been transformed into a pawn. And as history would soon prove, pawns can be sacrificed without hesitation. What seemed like security for young Margaret vanished almost overnight. The mighty Duke of Suffolk, William de la Pole, fell from grace with a swiftness that shocked even those hardened by court intrigue. Suffolk had risen high, trusted counselor to King Henry VI, the architect of the controversial marriage between Henry and Margaret of Anjou. To many, he was the man who surrendered England's pride. He had negotiated away Maine and Anjou, lands soaked with English blood during the 100 Years' War. For the common people, already weary of defeat and humiliation, this was treachery. For the nobility, it was unforgivable weakness. By 1450, fury boiled over. Suffolk was accused of corruption, betrayal, even treason. Though officially banished for 5 years instead of executed, his enemies had other plans. As he attempted to cross the Channel into exile, his ship was intercepted. What followed was not trial, but slaughter. Dragged from the safety of his vessel, the once great Duke was forced onto the deck of another ship. There, on planks slick with salt spray, he was ordered to kneel. The executioner's blade was no gleaming instrument of justice. It was a rusty sword, dull with age. Witnesses whispered that it took 6 strokes to sever his head. 6 brutal, clumsy blows before his lifeless body slid into the sea. News of Suffolk's death spread like fire across England. To some, it was justice. To others, it was horror. But to Margaret and her family, it was devastation. The betrothal carefully arranged to secure her future now turned to ash. The ink on the contract meant nothing. Alliances shifted faster than a child could grow. For Margaret, still a girl, the lesson was stark. In this world, security was an illusion. One moment, she was bound to a powerful family. The next, that family's name was stained with blood and disgrace. Her marriage contract became worthless parchment, her supposed protection dissolved in the waves of the Channel along with Suffolk's body. In those days, such brutality was not exceptional. Heads rolled in markets, bodies swung from gibbets, poison found its way into chalices. Political life was a dance on a floor slick with blood. Margaret's early experiences would etch that reality into her heart. Survival meant adaptability. No betrothal was permanent. No promise was safe. Alliances could collapse as quickly as the man they were built upon could be dragged screaming to his knees. For the Beaufort women, there was no time for mourning Suffolk's fall. They had to adapt again. Margaret's mother began weaving new alliances, searching for another match that could
After Suffolk's fall, Margaret's future might have seemed uncertain. But in the treacherous landscape of 15th century politics, new alliances bloomed as quickly as old ones withered. And this time, fate tied her to a family whose name would echo through history. Tudor. The Tudors were not ancient nobility. They were, in truth, Welsh upstarts, risen from obscurity through an audacious love affair. Owen Tudor, a courtier of modest beginnings, had caught the eye of Catherine of Valois, the widowed queen of Henry V. Their union, secret and scandalous, had defied convention and enraged the nobility. But from that forbidden marriage came sons recognized by King Henry VI, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. It was to Edmund, Earl of Richmond, that Margaret was given in marriage, around 1455. The ceremony took place at Pembroke Castle, where her childhood had unfolded. She was 12 years old, still slight and thin, her face more child than woman. Edmund was in his mid-20s, hardened by politics and war, far older in both body and mind. To the nobles arranging the match, the marriage was brilliant strategy. Edmund Tudor was half-brother to King Henry VI, the fragile monarch at the heart of the Lancastrian cause. By wedding Margaret Beaufort, Edmund bound the royal Beaufort bloodline to the Tudor name, elevating his family's status immeasurably. To Margaret's mother, it was security once again. To Edmund, it was power. But for Margaret, it was something else entirely. A prison she could not escape. At 12, she could scarcely understand the vows she recited before priest and witnesses. The tapestries that hung in the great hall depicted her Beaufort ancestors in battle and glory. Yet she herself had no say in the war now being waged upon her own body. There was no concept of waiting for maturity, no pause to allow childhood to fade. Noble girls were broodmares for dynastic ambition, and Margaret was no exception. The marriage was consummated almost immediately. For her, it was trauma, an ordeal she never spoke of directly in later years, though the silence itself tells the story. Historians see its marks in the permanent damage done to her body, damage that would define her future and shape her devotion to God. Yet even in this cruelty, the wheel of history turned. Within months, Margaret was pregnant. The child within her womb would one day be the answer to Lancaster's despair, a boy who would inherit both Beaufort and Tudor blood. With child, it hardly mattered. Margaret Beaufort, already bound to a destiny not of her choosing, was now a pregnant widow in a kingdom spiraling into civil war. The union of Beaufort and Tudor had been sealed, but the cost was staggering. Margaret, scarcely more than a child, was left alone to carry not just a son, but the fragile hope of an entire dynasty.
The year was 1456. While Margaret struggled through the early months of her pregnancy, her husband Edmund Tudor marched into the turmoil of Wales. He was no great general, but he bore the title Earl of Richmond and the blood of a king's half-brother. That alone made him a target. The Wars of the Roses had begun to stir, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, preparing to tear the kingdom apart. Loyalties shifted like waves upon the shore, and Edmund's position placed him in the storm's center. Captured by Yorkist forces at Carmarthen Castle, he was taken prisoner. What happened next remains shrouded in suspicion. The chronicles say plague carried him off. In truth, disease swept through the damp, filthy cells of medieval prisons with terrifying speed. But contemporaries doubted the story. Why had Edmund sickened so quickly? Why were physicians barred from attending him? Why did his decline seem too sudden, too convenient? To Lancastrian supporters, it reeked of murder. To Margaret, the cause hardly mattered. What mattered was that he was gone. By November, the news reached her. Edmund Tudor was dead. She was 13 years old, heavy with child, and already a widow. Imagine her in that moment. A girl not long out of childhood, carrying a child of her own, learning from a breathless messenger that she was alone in the world. The echoes of his boots on the chapel stones where she prayed for her husband's safe return must have sounded like hammer blows against her fragile heart. Her body trembled not only with the weight of her pregnancy, but with the crushing realization she had no protector, no husband, and no certainty for the future. In a world where women's security depended upon the men they were bound to, Margaret now stood precariously exposed. Her youth made her vulnerable. Her unborn child made her both more valuable and more endangered. Enemies of Lancaster could see in her belly a threat, a possible heir who might one day rally armies. Friends of Lancaster saw in her the fragile vessel of their last hope. Either way, her fate was no longer her own. The loneliness of those months cannot be overstated. While other girls her age clutched dolls or embroidered cloth, Margaret clutched her swelling belly, whispering prayers to a God she hoped was listening. Every creak of the castle, every shadow in the corridor, carried with it the possibility of betrayal. She had been thrust into the dangerous role of dynastic mother before she had even reached womanhood. It is difficult to imagine the terror of such a position. To be 13, widowed, pregnant, and surrounded by whispers of war, it was more than most grown women could bear. Yet Margaret did not collapse. Though grief-stricken, she endured. In her endurance lay the first glimpses of the steel that would one day define her. After Edmund's death, the duty of protection fell to his younger brother Jasper Tudor. Barely 24, Jasper had inherited not only his brother's titles, but also his brother's widow. Margaret, still only 13, her body straining under the weight of a child. For Jasper, the responsibility was both political and personal.
In Margaret's womb lay the fragile continuation of the Tudor line, a potential heir who could secure Lancaster's fading fortunes. He decided to bring her to his stronghold, Pembroke Castle in southwest Wales. From its high limestone cliffs above Milford Haven, the fortress loomed over the crashing Atlantic waves. It was remote, defensible, and far from the immediate grasp of Yorkist enemies. Yet the road to Pembroke was anything but safe. The journey began in the damp chill of late autumn. Margaret traveled in a covered litter, her body racked by the aches of pregnancy. The path wound through mud-choked roads and forests where the allegiance of armed men was uncertain. Some villages swore loyalty to Lancaster, others to York. Most cared only for survival and would turn to banditry at the sight of a vulnerable party. Jasper rode ahead with armed retainers, their eyes sharp for danger. Behind, servants coaxed stubborn horses through ruts half-filled with frozen water. Each mile was a trial. The jolts of the litter sent stabbing pains through Margaret's young body. She clutched at her belly, whispering prayers, fearing that every bump might bring on labor too soon. Her attendants did their best to comfort her, offering broth and dried herbs, but nothing could ease the anxiety. She was 13, a widow, and about to give birth in the middle of a civil war. The countryside bore its own scars. Farmhouses stood abandoned, fields lay fallow, smoke rose from villages pillaged by passing troops. Even nature seemed hostile. Flooded rivers forced detours, icy winds bit through cloaks, and nights spent in drafty inns or hastily secured manor houses offered little rest. At every stop, Margaret must have wondered whether Yorkist soldiers or common thieves might storm through the door. Yet through this ordeal, Jasper did not falter. He treated his sister-in-law with a mixture of duty and genuine care, ensuring her safety at every crossing. Chroniclers later noted that he would become her greatest ally, a man who would risk everything to protect the boy she carried. Already, their bond was being forged on those dangerous winter roads. When at last the walls of Pembroke Castle rose before them, Margaret must have felt both relief and dread. Relief because the towering fortress promised protection. Dread because she knew that within those walls she would face the greatest trial of her short life. The birth of a child her fragile body might not survive. The castle itself was a stark refuge. Its massive round keep had stood for centuries, weathering storms and sieges alike. To some, it was a symbol of strength.
To Margaret, it was a stone prison, cold and unyielding, where she would endure pain that would shape her destiny. In her litter, exhausted and trembling, she crossed the drawbridge. The great gates closed behind her with a groan of iron and oak. The wars outside raged on, but for Margaret, the battlefield was already within her. Pembroke Castle was a fortress of survival, not of comfort. Perched high above the estuary, its great stone walls kept enemies at bay, but offered little warmth to those within. In the winter of 1456, the Atlantic gales howled through arrow slits and chimney flues, filling the chambers with an icy breath that no fire could banish. Here, Margaret, 13, pregnant and already fragile, prepared for childbirth. Her body was still that of a child, her hips narrow, her bones not yet fully grown. Every physician who looked upon her saw danger. Dr. Louis Carleon, a learned man who had studied medicine at Oxford and Paris, examined her with grim resignation. He whispered to Jasper Tudor what no one dared say aloud to Margaret. This birth could kill her. The baby was large, the mother too small. The position of the child was uncertain. Carleon had seen it before, and the outcomes were rarely merciful. To attempt to turn the baby could kill both. To wait too long could exhaust the mother and strangle the child. The thought of a cesarean was unthinkable. It was, in those days, a death sentence for the mother. In the cold stone chamber prepared for her confinement, midwives bustled, led by the formidable Gwen Furch David, a Welshwoman who had delivered children for 3 decades. She knew every herb and prayer, every technique handed down through generations of women. Her hands were steady, but her eyes betrayed worry. Even with all her skill, the odds were cruel. To ease Margaret's fears, the women filled the chamber with the smoke of burning herbs.
lavender for calm, rosemary for strength. Tapestries were hung thick against the drafts, though the wind still found cracks to whistle through. Icons of saints were placed beside the bed, their painted eyes watching silently, as if weighing the fate of mother and child. Margaret herself clung to religion as tightly as she clung to life. Hours were spent in prayer, her knees raw from kneeling before the altar in the castle's small chapel. She whispered litanies to the Virgin Mary, begged the intercession of St. Margaret of Antioch, patron of childbirth, and pressed rosary beads into her palms until the wood left marks on her skin. To her, survival was not just a matter of medicine, but of divine mercy. Outside her chamber, Jasper Tudor bore the weight of decisions no young man should face. If Margaret died, the fragile Tudor hope died with her. If the child perished, Lancaster lost one more heir in a time when heirs were priceless. The future of a dynasty balanced on the labor of a child mother shivering in a castle battered by winter storms. Each day, as Margaret's body swelled and weakened, the tension grew. Servants whispered of omens, ravens circling the battlements, wolves howling.
Smoke and silence. The midwives watching her with the eyes of women who had seen too many young brides bleed out upon the bed. She was barely more than a child, yet in her womb was a future that could tip the balance of kingdoms. Pembroke Castle stood tall and defiant against the winter winds, but within its walls, a storm far greater was about to break. It began with a sudden spasm that bent her double as she walked the battlements for exercise, as Dr. Carleon had insisted. Margaret clutched at the cold stone, her breath torn from her throat. The pain was sharp, tearing, unlike anything she had known. Her attendants hurried her back to her chamber, their faces pale. They knew what this meant. The labor had begun. At first, there was hope. The midwives, seasoned by years of birthing both noble and peasant children, guided her gently, speaking prayers, offering herbs steeped in steaming cups, the chamber filled with the smoke of lavender and rosemary, meant to soothe and strengthen. Margaret gripped the relic of St. Margaret of Antioch, patron of childbirth, pressing it so tightly that her knuckles blanched. But hours passed and the hope faded. The girl was too small. Each contraction racked her fragile frame, leaving her gasping like a bird with broken wings. Blood stained the linens, sweat poured down her face, her auburn hair tangled and plastered to her temples. The midwives exchanged silent glances, the kind of glances that spoke of fear they dared not voice. Outside the chamber, Jasper Tudor paced the corridor like a caged beast. He could hear her cries even through the heavy oak door. Each scream sliced into him, reminding him that the fate of the Lancastrian cause, indeed, the Tudor name itself, was trapped in that room along with the girl who bore his brother's child. Inside, the battle for life raged on. Dame Gwen, the chief midwife, worked tirelessly, changing Margaret's position, massaging her abdomen, whispering encouragement. Her hands were slick with blood, her eyes shadowed with worry. Instruments lay ready on the table, hooks, knives, forceps, grim reminders that childbirth was as much about death as it was about life. 18 hours. For 18 hours the girl endured agony that defied description. Her screams echoed off the stone until her voice failed, leaving only raw, guttural gasps. At times, she drifted toward unconsciousness, her lips moving in silent prayer, her fingers twitching as if grasping for a god she could not see. The midwives prayed aloud now, invoking saints and angels, calling for divine mercy. They burned herbs until the chamber was thick with smoke, both medicine and incense, as if heaven itself might be persuaded by the rising scent. As dawn crept gray and cold through the narrow windows, Margaret was almost spent. Her pulse fluttered weakly, her skin the color of parchment. The child within her womb still fought, its heartbeat faint but present. Dr. Carleon and Dame Gwen exchanged desperate whispers. To attempt a manual extraction might kill the mother. To wait any longer would kill them both. In that moment, the chamber became a battlefield, not of swords and shields, but of hands, prayers, and blood.
Dame Gwen steeled herself, whispered a final plea to St. Margaret, and reached into the young girl's broken body to guide the child into the world. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, the dreadful silence of uncertainty, the pause between life and death. Then, a thin, angry cry split the air. The child lived. The boy, Henry Tudor, had survived his bloody entrance into the world. Margaret, barely conscious, her body shattered and torn, tried to reach for him. Her hands trembled, but her eyes followed the infant with desperate intensity, memorizing his tiny face through the haze of exhaustion and pain. She had given England its future king, but at a cost that would scar her forever.
The chamber was heavy with silence after the child's cry faded into shallow whimpers. The midwives, their arms trembling from hours of labor, looked down at the fragile infant they had pulled from Margaret's broken body. Pale, bloodied, barely breathing, yet alive. It was enough. They placed the newborn briefly on Margaret's chest. Through the haze of exhaustion, fever, and pain, her eyes locked upon the tiny face. She tried to raise her arms, but they would not obey. Instead, her lips moved silently, forming words of prayer and gratitude. For an instant, the world seemed to pause. The girl of 13, her life spilling away, and the child who would change the fate of kingdoms. Henry Tudor, born of blood and suffering, was swaddled quickly and carried to the fire. The midwives worked frantically to coax his fragile breaths into strength. His first cry had been thin and uncertain, but as they rubbed his tiny body with cloths warmed by the hearth, the sound grew sharper, louder, a protest against the world he had entered. That sound, shrill, defiant, was the announcement of a dynasty. For Margaret, survival was not assured. Dr. Carleon examined her and whispered of torn flesh, damaged organs, blood loss that could not easily be stanched. She hovered between life and death for days, fever burning her skin, infection gnawing at her frail body. Her youth, ironically, may have saved her, her small frame still resilient enough to endure what would have killed older women. But the cost was permanent. Margaret would never bear another child. Her body, ravaged by this single birth, was closed forever to motherhood. Historians see in this moment the cruel paradox of her life. At 13, her womb was both her curse and her crown. In giving birth to Henry, she secured her place in history as the mother of a king. But she was also marked, physically scarred, psychologically haunted, and condemned to a lifetime defined by that single act. Outside the birthing chamber, the wider world barely noticed. England was distracted by its own unraveling. Rebellions brewing, nobles scheming, civil war simmering. Few would have thought that in a cold Welsh fortress, the future King of England had just drawn breath. Yet history often hides in such unlikely corners. To those who knew, however, the significance was clear. Jasper Tudor looked upon the child with a mixture of awe and calculation. Here was the fragile thread upon which the Lancastrian cause might someday be spun anew. A child whose claim might grow into a weapon sharper than any sword. And Margaret, shattered but unbroken, understood something too. Though her body was maimed, her spirit was not. The agony she endured would become the steel of her will. She had survived where others expected her to perish. Her son lived where many thought he would die. That combination of suffering and survival would shape them both. A dynasty had been born, not in glory but in pain, not with and banners, but with screams and blood. Yet from that chamber, in Pembroke Castle, emerged the boy who would one day end the Wars of the Roses and plant upon his head the crown of England. And beside him, though history would not yet recognize it, stood his mother, the girl who had given everything to bring him into the world, and who would spend the rest of her life ensuring he kept it. The weeks after Henry's birth were a blur of agony and fever. Margaret hovered on the edge of death, her young body ravaged by injuries no physician could fully heal. Dr. Carlyon tried every remedy, bloodletting to balance humors, poultices of herbs, strong wine laced with bitter medicines. Midwives spooned broth between her cracked lips, whispering prayers with every sip. Sometimes she drifted into delirium, seeing visions of saints in the flicker of candlelight, hearing voices that may have been angels or fevered dreams. Somehow she lived, but she emerged from the ordeal changed forever. The physical wounds never truly healed. She walked with a slight stiffness, and the scars within her body left her barren, incapable of bearing another child. For a girl of 13, this might have seemed a cruel curse, yet Margaret did not see it that way. To her, it was a sign, painful, yes, but also purposeful. God had chosen her for something beyond ordinary motherhood. Her survival deepened a religiosity that bordered on obsession. She spent hours in the castle chapel, kneeling until her knees bled, reciting Latin prayers with a precision that astonished her confessors. She fasted, wore coarse garments beneath her gowns, and whispered litanies into the night. To outsiders, it was the zeal of a girl scarred by trauma. To Margaret, it was communion with a God who had spared her life for a reason. But Margaret's transformation was not merely spiritual. She began to observe, to learn. With Jasper Tudor at her side, she listened to the language of politics, absorbing the lessons of survival in a kingdom fractured by civil war. She learned how alliances were made not in public, but in whispers behind closed doors. She studied the way men cloaked threats in courtesy, how gifts concealed obligations, how loyalty was bought with coin and broken with rumor. Her tutors expanded her world beyond prayer books. Father Meredith, the castle's priest, guided her in theology, but also in the politics of faith. God works through human hands, he told her. Prayer without action is emptiness. Action without prayer is folly. Margaret took the lesson to heart. Her faith was no longer a shield from suffering. It became a weapon to guide her choices. Even in her fragile state, she displayed a precocious intelligence. Servants whispered that she remembered every word spoken around her, that she could repeat entire conversations days later. Jasper recognized the sharpness of her mind and encouraged it. He saw in her not just a widow to be protected, but a potential ally, a woman who might one day wield influence equal to a man's. Yet beneath this newfound strength lay shadows. Nightmares plagued her, visions of childbirth returning in blood. Complicated, marked by love but also by trauma. Holding him sometimes brought comfort, sometimes unbearable flashbacks. Still she clung to him, knowing he was her only child, her only legacy. In those early months, Margaret Beaufort began the journey from child to strategist. She had faced death and endured. She had been made a widow and survived. And now, in the dim halls of Pembroke, she began to weave the threads of resilience, intelligence, and faith that would one day make her one of the most formidable women in English history. The girl who had nearly died in childbirth was gone. In her place stood a survivor. Wounded, yes, but already hardening into something stronger. By 1458, scarcely a year after surviving the peril of childbirth, Margaret Beaufort was again at the altar. She was 15 now, still frail from her ordeal, but old enough by the standards of her time to be given once more in marriage. Her bridegroom was Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The wedding was a quiet affair, stripped of pageantry. There were no grand processions, no lavish banquets to honor the match.
It was a union forged not by love, but by necessity. Margaret needed protection. Her estates, her Beaufort bloodline, and most of all, her infant son, made her both valuable and vulnerable. In the ruthless logic of civil war, an unwed noblewoman with a claim to the throne was a liability. A married one could be shielded behind her husband's name. Henry Stafford was no Edmund Tudor. He was older, pragmatic, and cautious. A man without great ambition, but with enough sense to see the danger surrounding his young wife. His sympathies leaned toward the Yorkists, but he was not a zealot. For him, marrying Margaret was not about dynastic dreams, but about securing estates and influence through alliance. For Margaret, the marriage was safety. Nothing more, nothing less. She had no illusions of affection. Her body was still marked by the trauma of her first union. Intimacy was something she endured, not desired. This was not a union of hearts, but a calculated shield against the chaos tearing England apart. The Wars of the Roses had already erupted. The First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 had shown the kingdom what was to come. Blood spilled not on foreign fields, but in English streets. The Roses of York and Lancaster would continue to clash for decades, and Margaret understood that her survival and her sons depended on aligning herself with strength. In her new household, Margaret continued to grow in wisdom and subtlety. She watched Stafford navigate loyalties, saw how carefully he measured words before speaking, how he balanced ties to both sides of the conflict. From him, she learned the art of pragmatism, the necessity of compromise, the value of patience. But safety came at a cost. The marriage was not one of passion or tenderness. It was a business arrangement, sealed with vows, but lived with caution. Margaret, who had already learned too young that security was an illusion, accepted it with the cold clarity of a survivor. She wore her role with composure, even as she longed to be closer to her son, who remained in Jasper Tudor's care in Wales. This second marriage gave her years of relative stability, yet beneath the calm surface, the kingdom grew ever more turbulent. Time for her son to grow, time for her to learn, time for her destiny to ripen. While Margaret settled uneasily into her new life with Henry Stafford, her heart remained across the mountains and rivers of Wales. There, at Pembroke Castle, her infant son was being raised, not by her, but by Jasper Tudor. The arrangement was both practical and painful. Jasper could offer Henry protection and political shelter that Margaret, a vulnerable teenage widow remarried into another household, simply could not. But in giving him up, she surrendered the most natural bond of all, that between mother and child. Margaret saw Henry only rarely, perhaps once or twice a year, and even then under strict conditions. The boy she had nearly died to bring into the world became a stranger raised in another's care. As he grew, she heard reports. He was tall for his age, quiet but thoughtful, more observer than speaker, much like his mother. Jasper taught him to ride, to hunt, to read the Welsh tongue, and to command loyalty from hardened men who respected the Tudors as much as they resented them. Henry's education was shaped by exile and uncertainty, lessons in survival more than privilege. For Margaret, absence became agony. Each year that passed widened the distance between them, turning her son from a baby she had once held against her fevered chest into a boy she barely knew. To fill the void, she wrote letters, carefully phrased, often coded in case they were intercepted. She sent small gifts when she could, books, clothing, tokens of affection meant to remind him of the mother who lived in another world. Whether he understood their significance, whether he cherished them or simply tucked them away, Margaret could not know. Her longing was sharpened by fear. Every rumor from Wales carried the weight of dread. Had Yorkist forces moved closer? Was Jasper still loyal? Was Henry healthy? alive. In a time when disease could claim a child overnight, when betrayal could snuff out a life without warning, Margaret lived in constant anxiety. She prayed for him daily, sometimes hourly, whispering his name to God as if each prayer might form a shield around him. Yet her separation from Henry also became her training ground. She learned patience, discipline, and above all, strategy. She began to understand that influence did not always require presence, that sometimes the hand guiding events could remain invisible. While Jasper raised her son in Wales, Margaret began weaving a quiet web of connections at court and in the noble households around her. Her child was her future, but her role was to ensure that future remained possible. The paradox of Margaret's motherhood was cruel. She loved fiercely, but from afar. The boy who should have been her comfort was instead her purpose, a distant figure around whom she built her will. In protecting him from the shadows, Margaret was already becoming the woman history would remember, not merely the mother of Henry Tudor, but the architect of his destiny.
England was tearing itself apart. From the 1450s onward, the Wars of the Roses escalated into a storm that swallowed towns, families, and entire dynasties. Battles were fought not on distant soil, but in the fields of Yorkshire, the streets of London, and the valleys of Wales. The blood of noblemen and peasants alike stained the snow, and the question of who was king seemed to change with every season. The Battle of Towton in 1461 was the bloodiest of them all. Palm Sunday turned into a slaughter. As many as 50,000 men clashed in a blizzard. The white rose of York against the red of Lancaster. By nightfall, the fields were littered with corpses, and the streams ran red with blood. Edward IV, the Yorkist claimant, emerged victorious, and Henry VI, the weak, faltering Lancastrian king, was forced into hiding. For Margaret Beaufort, it was a chilling reminder. Her bloodline had tied her irrevocably to a cause that seemed doomed. Yet she did not despair. Margaret adapted. She began to study people as carefully as she once studied her prayer books, watching for signs of loyalty, gauging intentions in casual words, learning which smiles concealed daggers. Her faith deepened, but now it blended with calculation. God, she believed, worked through human hands, and her task was to discern which hands were safe to clasp and which to avoid. In her household with Henry Stafford, she played the role of dutiful wife, but beneath that exterior, she quietly wove threads of survival. Stafford himself was no fanatic. Though his sympathies leaned toward York, he had seen the cruelty of Edward IV's rule, the capricious rewards, the brutal punishments. He had fought for the Yorkist king, even bled for him, but the gratitude was meager. A wound at the Battle of Edgecote left him lame, bitter, and disillusioned. Margaret, with her patient words and gentle influence, fanned those embers of doubt. She never spoke openly of rebellion. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, she planted small seeds, questions about Edward's judgment, quiet reminders of Lancaster's legitimacy, stories of Yorkist corruption whispered at the right moment. She learned that influence was not about confrontation but persuasion, slow and steady, until her husband's loyalties began to shift. Meanwhile, her son Henry grew under Jasper's watchful eye in Wales. Every victory or defeat on the battlefield carried implications for his survival. Margaret lived in constant tension. If Lancaster collapsed, Henry could be hunted down and killed as a potential heir. If Lancaster triumphed, he might be thrust into the center of power unprepared. Either outcome threatened. By the late 1460s, she was no longer simply the child bride who had nearly died in childbirth. She was becoming something else entirely. A strategist in her own right. Her prayers were still fervent, But her actions were deliberate. Where others saw only chaos, Margaret began to see opportunity. In 1471, the Lancastrian cause collapsed in flames. The decisive defeat at Tewkesbury saw the death of Prince Edward of Westminster, the last direct heir of Henry VI. Soon after, the king himself was found dead in the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered. With Lancaster's line extinguished, Yorkist triumph seemed absolute. For Margaret, the consequences were devastating. Her son Henry, still a teenager, suddenly became the last viable claimant to the Lancastrian legacy. That made him both precious and perilously exposed. Jasper Tudor smuggled him into exile across the Channel, first to Brittany, then deeper into continental hiding. Margaret, once again, was left alone. Her only child beyond her reach, living in uncertainty, his survival never guaranteed. Not long after, Henry Stafford, her second husband, succumbed to illness and the lingering effects of war wounds. His death freed Margaret to consider her next step, though the choice was fraught with danger. As a wealthy heiress of Beaufort blood, she was still valuable, still a potential bride. But with Yorkists in power, any miscalculation could mean ruin. Her decision was bold. She married Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of the shrewdest political operators in England. Stanley was not known for loyalty. On the contrary, he was infamous for his ability to switch sides at the last possible moment, ensuring he always backed the victor. To some, he was a traitor. To others, he was a survivor. To Margaret, he was exactly what she needed. Their marriage was no love match. It was an alliance of convenience, a pact between two survivors who understood that ambition and caution could be partners. For Margaret, Stanley's vast influence in the north of England and his control of private armies were invaluable. For Stanley, marriage to a Beaufort gave him proximity to royal blood and a foothold in the dangerous world of succession politics. The wedding itself was carefully staged, though not as lavish as the grand unions of kings and queens. It carried symbolism. Margaret was not retreating into obscurity, but positioning herself at the very center of power. Even Edward IV, the Yorkist king, attended, preferring to keep the dangerous Beaufort widow within reach rather than plotting in the shadows. Within this union, Margaret flourished. Stanley's household gave her access to information, his networks serving as fertile ground for her growing web of spies and correspondence. She corresponded with exiled Lancastrians, cultivated friendships with Yorkist ladies at court, and built bridges where others saw only divides. While her son languished in exile, Margaret was preparing England for his return. Her strategy was not born of rash defiance, but of patience. She understood that timing was everything. The Wars of the Roses, with his talent for hesitation, was the perfect match. Where others accused him of cowardice, Margaret saw calculation. And in that calculation, she found cover for her own ambitions. The widow who had once been a pawn was now playing the long game. Each letter she wrote, each alliance she nurtured, was another step toward a future where her exiled son would no longer be a fugitive, but a king. By 1483, the kingdom was once again plunged into chaos. Edward IV was dead. His young son declared King Edward V, but the boy never sat upon the throne. His uncle, Richard of Gloucester, seized power in a ruthless coup. The young Edward and his brother vanished into the Tower of London, never to be seen again. Whispers filled England. The princes had been murdered. Whether true or not, suspicion clung to Richard like a shroud. For Margaret, Richard's usurpation was both peril and opportunity. His claim was tainted, his reputation poisoned. Suddenly, her exiled son's distant lineage through the Beauforts seemed far less fragile. Against a man accused of murdering children, even a claimant born in a cold Welsh chamber could be painted as England's rightful hope. Margaret moved swiftly. From her household under Stanley's watchful eye, she wove conspiracies across England, corresponding with rebels, bishops, and disillusioned nobles. She coordinated uprisings at home with her son's plans abroad, letters written in codes and smuggled by servants, who risked death if discovered. It was a game of shadows, and Margaret played it with the precision of a master. The first rebellion in 1483 failed, exposing her plots. Richard placed her under house arrest, stripped her of titles, and might have executed her outright, were it not for her marriage to Stanley. Once again, her careful choice of husband saved her life. And even under confinement, Margaret continued to plan. She understood patience, she understood timing. That patience bore fruit 2 years later. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven, leading a modest force. He was no conqueror in appearance, an exile returning with borrowed troops, a claimant few had ever seen. But Margaret had prepared the ground. Whispers of hope had already spread. Allies waited, and most crucially, Thomas Stanley and his brother William commanded armies whose loyalty was deliberately ambiguous. At Bosworth Field, August 22, 1485, the fate of England turned on a knife's edge. Richard III, armored in steel, led a ferocious charge to cut Henry down himself. For a moment, it seemed the Yorkist king might succeed. Then the Stanleys moved. At the critical hour, their forces turned against Richard, surrounding him in the mud. Richard fought bravely, crying, "Treason!" as he was cut down. His crown was found in the mire and placed upon Henry's head. England had a new king, Henry VII. For Margaret, the moment was more than triumph. It was vindication. 28 years had passed since her scream echoed through the stone walls of Pembroke Castle. She had been a pawn, a child bride, a widow at 13, a mother torn from her son, a woman who survived by faith, intelligence.
Alliances were secured, most famously by orchestrating Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring roses into one house. She funded colleges, guided policies, and remained a central figure in her son's reign until her death in 1509, just days after seeing her grandson crowned Henry VIII. Margaret's tomb lies in Westminster Abbey, carved in black marble. Visitors read the Latin inscription praising her piety and achievement, but the stone cannot capture the full measure of her story. It cannot convey the scream of a girl in agony, the bitter prayers whispered in cold chapels, the patience of decades spent maneuvering through treachery and blood. That scream in 1457 had not just birthed a child, it had birthed a dynasty. The Tudor age of Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I was forged in her suffering, her sacrifice, her iron will. In the end, Margaret Beaufort was not simply the mother of a king. She was the mother of a dynasty, the woman who endured pain no child should face, and transformed it into power that changed the course of English history forever.